The dogs knew before anyone else. Their voices rose through the thick August night, low, hungry howls that rolled across the sugarcane fields of St. Mary Parish like a warning from hell itself. In the quarters behind the Beaumont plantation house, 53 souls went still. Hands froze over evening meals. Children stopped mid-breath. Even the crickets seemed to quiet, as if the very air had learned to fear that sound. Naomi pressed her grandson against her chest, covering his ears with trembling hands. The boy was only 4, too young to understand, but old enough to sense the terror that gripped every adult in the room. Through the gaps in the cabin walls, moonlight painted thin silver lines across the dirt floor. Beyond those walls, somewhere out there in the darkness, the bloodhounds sang their terrible song. "Mama!" The child's whisper cut through the silence. "Hush now." Her voice barely carried across the inches between them. "Don't make a sound." Because when the dogs sang like that, it meant only one thing. Someone had run. And when someone ran, he came. They never spoke his name aloud after sunset. To say it was to summon him, or so the old ones claimed. But everyone knew who the dogs belonged to. Everyone knew whose gray mare would appear on the shell roads come morning, moving silent as smoke between the oak trees. Everyone knew the man who had hunted their people for 15 years and never, not once, failed to bring them back. Silas Garrison. 2 words that carried more weight than iron shackles. 2 words that made grown men who'd survived the Middle Passage cross themselves and pray. Mothers told their children about him in whispers, the way other mothers told stories about ghosts. But Silas Garrison was no ghost. He was flesh and blood and far more frightening because of it. The overseer's wife claimed she'd seen him once, standing at the edge of the swamp before dawn, so still he might have been carved from wood. She said his eyes were gray as winter sky, cold and distant as judgment itself. She said he moved through the wilderness like he was part of it, like the trees and water answered to him alone. But it was what the captured ones said, those who'd run and been dragged back, that truly chilled the blood. They spoke of a man who tracked like he could read their thoughts, who followed trails that shouldn't exist, who appeared where no tracker should be able to go. Some claimed he had unnatural gifts. Others said he'd made bargains with dark powers in exchange for his terrible skill. The truth, as always, was both simpler and more complicated than superstition allowed. In the quarters that night, as the dogs finally quieted and the normal sounds of evening slowly returned, Naomi held her grandson tight and thought of her son. Tobias. 23 years old, strong as an oak, with his father's quick mind and his grandmother's stubborn heart. She hadn't seen him in 3 days. 3 days since he'd been sent to work the far fields. 3 days since anyone had spoken his name where the overseers could hear. She knew. The way mothers always know. And if she knew, then by morning, so would Silas Garrison. 17 miles north, in a modest wooden house on the edge of Franklin, a man sat alone at a plain table. No wife. No children. No visitors who came calling after dark. Just him and the silence and the leather-bound journal. He never showed another living soul. A knock came at the door near midnight. Silas Garrison didn't rise immediately. He finished the sentence he was writing, careful script in black ink, the letters even and precise. Then he closed the journal, placed it on the shelf beside 14 others just like it, and walked to answer. The house servant stood on the porch, hat in hand, eyes fixed on the floorboards. He held out a sealed letter, said nothing, waited only long enough to be certain Silas had taken it before turning and hurrying back toward the road. No one lingered at Silas Garrison's door longer than necessary. Inside, by candlelight, Silas broke the seal. The letter was brief, the handwriting sharp with urgency. One missing. Male. 23 years. Strong build. Answers to Tobias. 3 days gone. Reward, $300. Charles Beaumont. Silas read it twice. Then he fed it to the candle flame and watched it curl into ash. By dawn, he would be ready. The gray mare. The bloodhounds. The rope and shackles and all the tools of his trade. Everything prepared with the precision of a man who'd performed this ritual 100 times before. But first, he returned to his shelf, drew down the current journal, opened to a fresh page, and began to write. August 12, 1847. St. Mary Parish. Male, age 23. Name, Tobias. His pen paused above the paper. For just a moment, something flickered across his face, an emotion too quick to name, too deeply buried to surface fully. Then it was gone, and he continued writing. The hunt had begun. Before we continue, I need to ask you something. If you're listening from anywhere in the Deep South, or from any corner of this country where hidden histories still whisper through the walls of old buildings, leave a comment telling me where you're from. This channel survives because of listeners like you who hunger for the truth that history tried to bury. Hit that subscribe button because what you're about to hear has never been told in full. And stories like this deserve to be remembered. 3 days earlier, Tobias had stood in the sugarcane fields with the sun beating down like divine punishment, wondering if a man could die from hope. The cane grew taller than his head, green stalks thick as a man's wrist, crowned with feathery plumes that caught the breeze and mocked the stillness of the air below. Down in those rows, the heat didn't just surround you. It inhabited you, filled your lungs, soaked through your skin, turned your blood to something slow and thick. His machete rose and fell in rhythm with 20 others. Slash, step, slash, step. The blade bit through cane with a wet crunch that had become the metronome of his existence. His hands were wrapped in strips of cloth torn from an old shirt, but they still bled. Everyone's hands bled. You learned to ignore it the way you learned to ignore thirst, hunger, the fire in your shoulders that never quite went out. Keep your head down, his mother had told him since he was old enough to walk. Move like smoke. Be invisible. Naomi had survived 37 years on the Beaumont place by perfecting the art of disappearing in plain sight. She'd taught him which overseers could be reasoned with, and which ones enjoyed cruelty for its own sake. She'd shown him how to make himself small, how to swallow anger until it became something else, something that didn't get you killed. But there were some things even smoke couldn't hide. Tobias had been 7 years old the morning they took his father. The memory lived in him like a scar that never quite healed. His father, whose name had been Amos, had learned to read from newspapers the plantation owners' sons tossed aside. He'd hidden this knowledge the way other men hid valuables, taking it out only in the deepest hours of night, teaching Tobias to recognize letters by drawing them in the dirt with a stick. Then someone had seen. Someone had told. They'd chained Amos in the yard before dawn, made everyone watch. Charles Beaumont himself had stood on the porch, coffee in hand, as the trader examined his father like livestock. Troublemaker, Beaumont had said. Too smart for his own good. Send him to the cotton fields down in Mississippi. Let him think himself clever there. Tobias could still hear the rattle of those chains, could still see his father's face as they led him away, not afraid, but resigned, as if he'd always known this was coming. As if learning to read was worth the price he'd pay. His mother had held him back that morning, her hand clamped over his mouth to keep the screams inside. Later, alone, she'd said only this. Your father chose death over living like this. Don't you make that same choice. But standing in the cane fields 15 years later, Tobias understood something his mother didn't. His father hadn't chosen death. He'd chosen to be human. There was a difference. Survival wasn't the same as living. You could survive as smoke, invisible and formless. But smoke had no weight, no substance. It existed only to drift and dissipate and eventually vanish as if it had never been at all. The overseer passed between the rows, hickory stick in hand, counting heads. Tobias kept his eyes on the cane, his blade moving steady. Invisible. Just another body in the field. But inside his chest, something had shifted. He'd been planning it for months. Watching the patrol patterns. Memorizing the phases of the moon. Listening to the stories the old ones told about the swamps, which paths led somewhere and which led only to drowning. He'd saved scraps of food, hidden them beneath a loose board in the cabin floor. He'd wrapped his best shirt around his feet at night to toughen the soles. And he'd made peace with the possibility that he might die trying. That night, after the bells rang and the field workers returned to the quarters, Tobias ate his evening meal slowly. Cornmeal mush and a piece of salt pork no bigger than his thumb. He watched his mother move about the cabin, tending to his nephew, banking the fire. She hummed something low and mournful, a song from before, from the other side of the ocean, passed down through generations who'd survived by remembering. She didn't look at him, but he knew she felt his gaze. "Mama," he said quietly. "Don't." Her voice was firm. "Don't say what you're about to say." Silence stretched between them, heavy as the humid air. "I love you," Tobias said finally. Naomi's hands stilled. For a long moment, she stood motionless. Then she crossed the small room and placed something in his palm. A carved wooden bird, no bigger than a coin. His father had made it years ago, before the chains. "Then live," she whispered. "That's all I ask. Whatever you do, live." When the cabin went dark and the breathing around him settled into sleep, Tobias rose. He took nothing but the clothes on his back and the wooden bird in his pocket. At the door, he paused. Looked back one final time at the only home he'd ever known. Then he stepped into the night, and the boy who'd learned to live like smoke became something solid. He ran. The swamp swallowed him whole. Within an hour of leaving the Beaumont place, Tobias had crossed from the world of men into something older, something that existed before plantations and overseers and the illusion that anyone could truly own another human being. Here, in the bayou, the only law was survival. The water came first. Black as spilled ink, it reflected nothing. Not the stars, not the sliver of moon that occasionally broke through the canopy above. He'd entered at the edge of what the field workers called the drowning trees, where the cypress roots rose from the shallows like the gnarled fingers of giants trying to claw their way out of the earth. The water reached his thighs, warm as blood, thick with things he couldn't see and didn't want to imagine. Every step released bubbles that broke the surface with soft, obscene pops. The smell hit him like a fist, rot and vegetation and something ancient, something that predated human memory. It wasn't just a scent. It was a taste, coating his tongue and the back of his throat until he thought he might gag. But he kept moving. His mother had told him once about the Middle Passage, about the hold of the ship that brought her own mother across the ocean. "You survive," she'd said, "by putting your mind somewhere else. Somewhere the body can't follow." Tobias tried that now, tried to think of anything except the cold fear crawling up his spine, but the swamp wouldn't let him drift. It demanded his full attention, or it would claim his life. Something brushed against his leg beneath the water. He froze, heart hammering, but whatever it was moved on. An alligator, maybe. Or a cottonmouth. The bayou was thick with both, and in the darkness, he couldn't tell which way was safe and which was suicide. He moved only at night, the way he'd planned. During the day, He found the driest ground he could, usually the exposed roots of cypress trees, and tried to rest while mosquitoes feasted on any exposed skin. Sleep came in fragments, never deep enough to heal but just enough to keep him moving when darkness returned. On the second night, he stripped moss from the trees and wrapped it around his feet. The shells and broken branches hidden in the mud had torn through his soles, leaving bloody prints that dogs would follow like breadcrumbs. The moss helped mask the scent, or so the stories claimed. He prayed the stories were true. Food was scarce. He found wild berries, small, bitter things that did more to sharpen his hunger than satisfy it. He caught crawfish with his bare hands, cracking them open and eating the meat raw, trying not to think about what they might have been feeding on in these dark waters. Once, he stumbled upon a cluster of cattails and tore at the roots with desperate fingers, choking down the pale flesh. But it wasn't enough. His body was burning through reserves he didn't have, demanding fuel he couldn't provide. On the third night, moving through water up to his chest, Tobias heard voices. He pressed himself against a cypress trunk, barely breathing. Through the Spanish moss that hung like funeral shrouds, he could see lights dancing between the trees. Lanterns. At least 3 of them, moving in a search pattern. Couldn't have gone far. A voice drifted across the water. Not in this. Beaumont's offering 300. Another voice, younger, eager. 300 for 1 runner. We find him, we split it. Patrollers. Not official slave catchers, just local men who supplemented their income by hunting human beings for sport and profit. They were amateurs compared to someone like Silas Garrison, but amateurs could still kill you. Tobias slid deeper into the water, until only his nose and eyes remained above the surface. The taste of the bayou filled his mouth, copper and decay and desperation. He held himself perfectly still as the lights swept closer, close enough that he could hear boots squelching through mud, could hear their breathing. Nothing here, one of them finally said. Probably drowned already. These boys never make it far. The lights retreated. Tobias stayed frozen for another hour, maybe longer, until his legs cramped and his lips went numb from the cold that seeped up from the deep water. When he finally moved again, his strength was failing. Not all at once. That would have been merciful. Instead, it left him in pieces. First his legs grew heavy, each step requiring conscious effort. Then his hands began to shake, making it difficult to grab hold of roots and branches when he needed to pull himself onto higher ground. His thoughts grew sluggish, drifting in and out of focus like smoke. He'd lost track of time. Was this the 3rd night, or the 4th? Had he been moving in circles? The bayou all looked the same, water and trees and darkness, an endless maze with no exit. On what he thought might be the 5th morning, though he could no longer be certain, Tobias collapsed on a muddy bank beside a nameless stream. The water here ran clearer than the swamp, dark as coffee but not quite as thick. He drank until his stomach cramped, then lay back against the exposed roots of a massive oak. Just for a moment, he told himself. Just long enough to catch his breath. The sun climbed higher. Heat pressed down. Insects hummed their endless song. And then, cutting through the morning air like a knife through flesh, came the sound he'd been dreading since the moment he ran. Dogs. Distant still, but unmistakable. Not the confused baying of amateur hounds following a cold trail, but the focused, purposeful howl of animals that had found their target and knew it. Tobias pushed himself upright, legs trembling, and looked at the stream before him. Behind him, the swamp. Ahead, unclear terrain. And closing in from the west, drawing nearer with each passing moment, the dogs. And where the dogs went, their master followed. Silas Garrison was coming. For days earlier, before Tobias ever heard those dogs, Silas Garrison had stood in his home at dawn and prepared to become a monster again. The house in Franklin was small. 3 rooms, wooden floors that creaked, walls bare except for a single mirror he rarely looked into. No photographs. No paintings. No evidence that anyone actually lived here rather than simply existed between hunts. The furniture was plain and functional. A table. 2 chairs, though no one ever sat in the second. A bed he made with military precision each morning. This was not a home. It was a place to wait between the terrible things he did for money. Silas moved through his preparation ritual with the efficiency of long practice. From the wooden chest beneath his bed, he removed the tools of his trade and laid them across the table in careful order. Rope. 60 feet of it, hemp fiber rough enough to tear skin. He checked each length for fraying, for any weakness that might allow a desperate man to break free. Found none. Shackles. Wrist irons connected by 18 inches of chain, the metal worn smooth by years of use. He tested the locks, oiled the mechanisms. They opened and closed with quiet clicks that sounded like small bones breaking. A pistol. Single shot, but he'd never needed more than 1 bullet. He cleaned it methodically, running the cloth down the barrel until it came away black with residue. Loaded it. Set it aside. A hunting knife. The blade measured 8 inches, sharp enough to shave with. He'd used it to cut through underbrush, to skin game for food on long hunts, and once, only once, for something he tried not to remember. A canteen. Strips of salted pork wrapped in cloth. Flint and steel. Everything a man needed to survive in the wilderness while hunting another human being. But there was one more thing. Something he removed not from the chest, but from a locked drawer in the small desk by the window. A leather-bound journal. It was worn, the cover soft from handling, the spine cracked from being opened and closed hundreds of times. Inside, the pages were filled with careful handwriting, his handwriting, in black ink that had faded to brown on the older entries. Silas carried it to the table and opened it to a blank page near the back. Only a few empty pages remained. Soon he would need to start a 15th volume. The thought sat in his stomach like something rotten. He dipped his pen and began to write. August 12, 1847. St. Mary Parish. Male, age 23. Name, Tobias. Mother, Naomi. Field worker, approximate 37 years. Father, sold to Mississippi Cotton Operation, 1839. Subject literate, possibly inherited trait. Last seen August 9th. Fled east toward Bayou Teche. His hand moved across the page with the practiced motion of someone who'd written these entries too many times to count. But if anyone had looked over his shoulder, which no one ever did, they would have seen something strange. The entries were too detailed, too personal. He didn't just record names and dates of capture. He recorded their stories, where they'd come from, who they'd left behind, what they'd whispered in the moments before he brought them back. The journal read less like a tracker's log and more like something else entirely, a testament, perhaps. Or a confession. On earlier pages, the words were accompanied by justifications. No choice. Winter coming. Must eat. This is survival. But as the volumes progressed, those justifications grew shorter, more desperate, until they disappeared entirely and only the facts remained. The names. The faces he couldn't forget no matter how hard he tried. Silas turned back several pages, to an entry from 3 months prior. Male, age 19. Name, Elijah. Captured near Lafourche. Bite marks on wrists, attempted to chew through rope during night. Returned to Dakota Plantation. Overseer's response. 30 lashes. Subject survived. He'd written that last part. Subject survived, as if it were a victory. As if survival under the lash was something to celebrate. The words mocked him now. He turned more pages. The entries stretched back for years, a catalogue of human suffering written in his own careful hand. Some he remembered vividly. Others had blurred together into a single nightmare of faces and chains and the sound of dogs baying in the darkness. Why did he keep these records? He'd asked himself that question 1,000 times and never found an answer that satisfied. Perhaps it was proof that these people had existed, that their attempts at freedom had meant something, even if they'd failed. Perhaps it was punishment, forcing himself to confront what he was, what he did, without the comfort of forgetting. Or perhaps it was something else. Something he was only beginning to understand in the deepest hours of night, when sleep wouldn't come and the faces from his journal crowded his small room like ghosts demanding recognition. Silas closed the book, wrapped it in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, placed it carefully in his saddlebag alongside the rope and shackles and all the other instruments of his profession. Outside, the gray mare waited, already saddled. She was 12 years old, steady and silent, trained to move through wilderness without disturbing the natural sounds of the forest. The bloodhounds, 2 of them, littermates with amber eyes and noses that could follow a trail 3 days cold, strained at their leads, eager to work. Silas mounted without ceremony, took the reins in one hand, the dog's leads in the other. The sun was barely above the horizon, painting the eastern sky in shades of amber and rose. It would be a beautiful day, the kind that made people thank God for the gift of living. Silas turned his horse toward St. Mary Parish and wondered, not for the first time, if God saw what he did in the shadows and counted it among the unforgivable sins. The hunt had begun, and somewhere in the swamps ahead, a young man named Tobias was running out of time. As Silas rode south toward the bayou, the rhythm of the horse's gait pulled him backward through time, to a place he'd spent 30 years trying to forget. Virginia. 1817. A tobacco plantation outside Richmond where the soil was red as rust and the summers stretched long and merciless. His mother's name had been Abney. She'd been stolen from a village on the Gold Coast, torn from her family at 14, shackled in the belly of a ship where the darkness was so complete you couldn't tell if your eyes were open or closed. The crossing had taken 63 days. Of the 400 people who'd been forced aboard, 217 survived to see American soil. Abney was one of them. She'd been purchased at auction in Charleston by a tobacco broker representing the Garrison family of Virginia. 19 years old by then, speaking no English, understanding nothing except that the world had ended and somehow she was still alive to witness its aftermath. The Garrison plantation was a world unto itself. 300 acres, 42 enslaved workers, a manor house with columns that gleamed white in the sun like bleached bones. The family patriarch, Edmund Garrison, had 3 sons. The eldest, Thaddeus, was 22 years old, handsome in the way that cruel men often are, with his father's sharp features and his mother's cold eyes. He'd seen Abney working in the tobacco fields 3 weeks after her arrival. What happened next was not a story of romance. There were no stolen glances, no forbidden courtship. What happened was what had happened to countless women in her position since the first ships arrived on these shores. Thaddeus Garrison wanted her. And men like Thaddeus Garrison took what they wanted. Silas was born 9 months later, in a cabin with a dirt floor and walls that let in the winter wind. His mother had labored alone except for 2 older women who knew enough of midwifery to keep her alive through the ordeal. When he emerged into the world, the women had exchanged glances that spoke volumes. The baby's skin was too light, his features too mixed. There would be no hiding who his father was. For the first 6 years of his life, Silas existed in a strange limbo. Too obviously the master's blood to be treated like the other children in the quarters, but too black to be acknowledged by the family in the big house. His mother loved him fiercely, taught him the stories of her people even though he would never see the land she came from. She sang him songs in a language he couldn't quite grasp, words that felt like prayers for a home that no longer existed. But she also taught him to be careful, to move quietly, to understand that his very existence was an embarrassment to powerful people, and embarrassed powerful people were dangerous. The other children kept their distance. The white overseer's kids called him names he learned not to respond to. The enslaved children didn't trust him, couldn't trust him, because he looked too much like the people who owned them. He belonged nowhere, accepted by no one, a living reminder of violence that everyone preferred to pretend hadn't happened. On the morning of his 6th birthday, not that anyone celebrated such things, Thaddeus Garrison came to the cabin where Silas and his mother lived. Silas remembered every detail of that morning. The way his father had stood in the doorway, blocking the light. The expensive fabric of his coat. The smell of tobacco and whiskey that seemed to emanate from his pores. His mother's face going very still, very careful. "The boy comes with me," Thaddeus had said. They'd walked to the big house in silence, Silas's small hand dwarfed by his father's grip. Inside, in a study lined with books Silas couldn't read, there were papers on a desk. Legal documents. A lawyer stood witness, his face carefully blank. Thaddeus had knelt down then, bringing his eyes level with his son's. Up close, Silas could see himself in his father's features, the shape of the nose, the set of the jaw. It was like looking at a ghost of what he might become. "You carry my name," Thaddeus said, his voice low and cold. "But you will not carry my shame." He signed the papers. Just like that, with a few strokes of a pen, Silas was free. Not because his father loved him. Not because Thaddeus Garrison had been struck by conscience or compassion. But because having a mixed-race child in bondage on his own plantation was an embarrassment. Freeing him was simply easier than explaining him. "Go north," Thaddeus had said, standing. "Find work. Make a life. But never come back here. And never," his voice dropped to something sharp as a blade, "never tell anyone who your father was." Silas was walked back to the cabin, given an hour to gather his things. His mother held him so tight he couldn't breathe, her tears soaking into his shirt as she whispered words in her language that he didn't understand but felt in his bones. She was saying goodbye. She knew, even if he didn't, that this was the last time she would hold her son. Then he was put on a wagon with a driver who'd been paid to take him as far as the county line, and the only world he'd ever known disappeared behind him. 6 years old. Free. And more alone than any child should ever be. He'd learned quickly what freedom meant for someone who looked like him. Too white to find safety among black communities, who saw his light skin and assumed collaboration with the enemy. Too black to be accepted in white society, where his features gave away his mother's heritage no matter how carefully he presented himself. Free, but belonging nowhere. Free, but always suspect. Free, but never quite human in anyone's eyes. He'd drifted for years, taking work where he could find it. Sleeping in stables. Going hungry more often than not. Learning that freedom without resources was just slavery with extra steps. You were still at the mercy of those with power, still forced to degrade yourself to survive, still reminded daily that the world had no place for you. And then, one brutal winter in Louisiana, starving and desperate, he'd accepted the offer that would define the rest of his life. Track down a runaway. Bring him back. Earn enough to eat for a month. He'd told himself it was temporary. Just until he got on his feet. Just until he had other options. But 15 years had passed, and he was still doing it. Still hunting people who looked like his mother. Still dragging them back to the bondage he'd been freed from. The gray mare stumbled slightly, bringing Silas back to the present. The sun was higher now, the morning heat already building. Ahead, the bayou waited, dark water and cypress trees, and somewhere in that maze, a young man named Tobias who was running out of time. Silas touched the saddlebag where his journal rested. 15 years of names. 15 years of faces. 15 years of becoming the very thing his mother would have wept to see. He'd been freed from chains at 6 years old. But he'd never, not for one single day, been free. The years between 6 and 21 had taught Silas Garrison a truth that most people never had to learn. Freedom was a word that meant different things depending on the color of your skin. He'd worked the docks in New Orleans, hauling cargo for pennies while men half as strong earned twice as much because their skin was the right shade. He'd mucked stables in Natchez, sleeping in the hayloft and eating scraps the horses wouldn't touch. He'd swept floors in taverns along the Mississippi, where drunk white men would sometimes forget he was in the room and say things that made his blood run cold, and other times remember he was there and say things that were worse. Always moving. Never staying long enough for anyone to ask too many questions. Never making friends because friendship required trust, and trust required revealing the truth about where you came from, who you were. And that truth, born in bondage to a white father who freed you out of shame, that truth belonged to no world he'd ever found. He learned to fight in those years. Had to. Men saw his light skin and mixed features and decided he needed to be taught his place, whichever place they decided he belonged to. He got good with his fists, better with a knife, and learned that survival meant being harder than the world that tried to break you. But fighting didn't fill your belly. The winter of 1832 came early and stayed late. By February, Silas hadn't eaten a full meal in 6 days. He'd been living in a boarding house in Terrebonne Parish, doing odd work for the owner, splitting wood, fixing the roof, anything to earn a bed and occasional food. But the work had dried up, and the owner had made it clear that charity only stretched so far. That's when the planter arrived. His name was Horace Duval, and he owned a rice operation 20 miles south. He'd been in town looking for help with what he called a situation. "Lost one of my workers 3 days back," Duval had said, loud enough for the whole common room to hear. "Young buck, strong, probably thinks he can make it to Texas. $20 to whoever brings him back." Silas had kept his head down, focused on the watery soup the owner had grudgingly provided. $20. That was 2 months of food. A new pair of boots. Enough to get somewhere else, start over, maybe find something better than this endless scrambling for survival. "You look like you know the wilderness," Duval had said, suddenly standing at Silas's table. "You got the eyes for it." Silas had met his gaze. Seen the calculation there. Duval knew what he was. Mixed, freed, desperate. The kind of person who might do things others wouldn't. "I'm not a tracker," Silas had said. "Then learn. $20. Plus expenses." Duval had leaned closer. "Or keep starving. Your choice." It hadn't felt like a choice at all. The first hunt lasted 4 days. The man's name was Isaac, 30 years old, with a wife and 2 children back on Duval's plantation. Silas tracked him through marshland, following broken branches and disturbed ground, using instincts he hadn't known he possessed. Something in him understood the logic of escape, where a desperate man would go, how he'd think, what risks he'd take. He'd found Isaac trying to cross a river, weak from hunger and exhaustion. "Please," Isaac had said, standing knee-deep in the current. "I have children. I just wanted." Silas had cut him off. Come back willingly or come back in chains. Makes no difference to me. But it had made a difference. Silas had seen his mother in Isaac's eyes. Had seen himself at 6 years old, being told he was free, but discovering that freedom was a lie we tell ourselves to make bondage more bearable. He'd brought Isaac back anyway. Collected his $20. Told himself it was survival. Told himself he had no choice. Told himself that one more time wouldn't matter, that he'd find other work, that this was temporary. The second hunt came 3 weeks later. Then a third. Then a fourth. Each time, it got easier. Not because the work became less terrible, but because Silas learned to build walls inside himself. Learned to see the people he hunted not as human beings with stories and families and dreams, but as problems to be solved, puzzles to be worked out. He learned to ignore their pleas, their tears, their desperate attempts to make him see them as real. He learned to become what they needed him to be. A tool. A weapon. A monster. By the 5th year, his reputation had spread. Plantation owners requested him specifically. They'd heard about the tracker who never failed, who could find anyone anywhere, who brought them back alive and mostly intact. The money improved. The jobs came regularly. Silas bought a house, modest but his own. Got his gray mare, trained his dogs. He started keeping the journal in the 7th year. At first, just names and dates, a practical record to keep track of his work. But slowly, almost against his will, he began adding details. Who they were. Where they'd come from. What they'd said in those final moments before he brought them back to bondage. He told himself it was documentation. But late at night, reading over the entries by candlelight, he knew it was something else. It was the only way he could acknowledge what he was doing. The only way he could force himself to see them as human, even as he made his living by treating them as property. The justifications he'd told himself, I have no choice, I must survive, this is not my fault, those justifications had worn thin over time, until they vanished entirely, and all that remained was the terrible truth. He'd chosen this. Every morning he woke and prepared for another hunt, he chose this. 15 years. 147 people returned to bondage. Not one of them escaped once he'd taken their trail. Until now. As Silas guided his mare deeper into the bayou, the dogs pulling eagerly at their leads, he carried that record with him. 147 faces that visited him in dreams. 147 names written in careful script in journals he could never bring himself to destroy. The trail was fresh now. The dogs had caught the scent. Somewhere ahead, through the cypress and the black water and the suffocating heat, Tobias was running out of places to hide. Silas had never failed. But for the first time in 15 years, part of him wondered what would happen if he did. The dogs found him at midday, when the sun turned the bayou into a steam bath and even the insects seemed too exhausted to move. Tobias had known they were close for hours. He'd heard them in the distance, their voices rising and falling like some terrible song, growing steadily louder despite every evasive tactic he'd learned. The moss wrapped around his feet hadn't worked. The water hadn't masked his trail. Nothing had worked. His body was shutting down. 5 days without real food, 5 nights of movement without rest, had stripped him to something barely recognizable. His hands shook constantly now. His vision blurred at the edges. When he tried to run, his legs buckled beneath him, muscles too depleted to obey even the most desperate commands. The stream where he'd collapsed that morning ran slow and dark, lined with roots that broke the surface like the backs of sleeping serpents. He'd been trying to drink, cupping water to his cracked lips, when the dogs' voices changed. Not searching anymore. Hunting. They'd found what they were looking for. Tobias looked around wildly. Behind him, thick swamp that would slow him down, maybe drown him. Ahead, open ground with no cover. To either side, nothing but water and trees that offered no sanctuary. He was out of options. His hand found a branch half submerged in the mud. A pathetic weapon, but the only one available. He'd sharpened one end against a rock that morning, more out of instinct than hope. Now he gripped it with fingers that barely had the strength to hold on, and waded into the stream until the water reached his chest. If they wanted him, they'd have to come through the current to get him. The dogs appeared first, bursting through the underbrush with their noses to the ground and their amber eyes fixed on their prey. Two of them, massive and lean, bred for this work across generations. They hit the edge of the stream and stopped, hackles raised, voices lifting in triumph. Then he appeared. Silas Garrison sat astride his gray mare like something carved from stone. He wore a simple shirt and pants, both marked with mud and swamp water. A pistol rested in his belt. Rope coiled over his saddle horn. He looked nothing like the demon from the stories Tobias had heard. No horns, no supernatural features. Just a man. Just another human being. But somehow that made it worse. Their eyes met across the water. Tobias saw something flicker in the tracker's face. Not cruelty, which he'd expected, but something stranger. Recognition, maybe. Or exhaustion that matched his own. "You cannot win this," Silas said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. Matter of fact, like he was commenting on the weather. Tobias tightened his grip on the sharpened stick. His whole body trembled. From fear, from exhaustion, from the terrible knowledge that this was how it ended. 5 days of running, 5 nights of hope, all leading to this moment in dark water with a man on horseback and dogs that wanted his blood. "Then I will die here." The words came out steady, stronger than he felt. "I will not go back in chains." The stick wouldn't do much against a pistol. Wouldn't stop the dogs if Silas released them. But Tobias raised it anyway, pointing it at the tracker like it was a sword instead of a piece of rotting wood. Something changed in Silas's face. The mask cracked, just for an instant, and beneath it Tobias saw something he couldn't name. Pain, maybe. Or regret so deep it had become part of the man's bones. The dogs strained at their ropes, snarling, eager for the command to attack. The mare stood perfectly still, trained to wait. The whole bayou seemed to hold its breath. Silas's hand moved toward the pistol at his belt. This was it. The end. Tobias braced himself, tried to think of his mother, tried to remember what freedom had tasted like even for just 5 days. But Silas's hand stopped. Hovered, then fell back to his side. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap. "There is a house," Silas said slowly, each word seeming to cost him something. 17 miles northeast of here. A Quaker family named Brooks. Tobias stared at him, certain he'd heard wrong. Certain this was a trap, some cruel game before the inevitable violence. "They will hide you," Silas continued, his voice barely audible above the sound of running water. "They will feed you. They will help you continue north when it is safe." The dogs whined, confused by the delay. The mare shifted beneath her rider. And Tobias stood in dark water, gripping his worthless stick, trying to understand what was happening. Silas dismounted slowly, like a man moving through water. The dogs barked frantically now, sensing their master's hesitation, confused by the break in routine. They'd done this 100 times before. Corner the prey, wait for the command, then the chase would end the way it always ended. With chains. With victory. With another name added to the journal. But something was different this time. Silas approached the water's edge, close enough that Tobias could see his face clearly, close enough to notice details the stories never mentioned. The tracker's eyes were gray, but not cold, tired, maybe, ancient, despite the fact that he couldn't have been more than 37 years old. There were lines around his mouth that spoke of words swallowed, expressions suppressed, emotions buried so deep they'd become sediment. Why? The word tore itself from Tobias's throat, raw and disbelieving. His sharpened stick wavered, but he kept it raised. Why would you help me? Silas didn't answer immediately. He stood at the stream's edge, looking at this young man standing chest deep in water with nothing but hope and desperation keeping him upright. And in that moment, something inside Silas cracked. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling, like ice breaking on a river in spring, sudden and irreversible. He saw his mother. Not literally. Tobias looked nothing like Ebony. But in the defiance of his stance, in the desperate courage it took to face certain capture with nothing but a stick and the willingness to die rather than submit. In that, Silas saw her. Saw the woman who'd survived the Middle Passage, who'd endured violation and bondage and the theft of her child, who'd somehow kept enough humanity intact to love him despite everything the world had done to destroy her capacity for love. He saw every person he'd ever dragged back. 147 faces, each one as real as Tobias. Each one with mothers who'd loved them, dreams they'd carried, reasons for running that were as valid as any reason for living. He saw himself at 6 years old, standing in his father's study, being told he was free. But what had that freedom been for? What had he done with the gift his mother had given him? Her blood, her stories, her fierce love. He'd used it to hunt her people, to drag them back to the bondage she'd died still trapped in. The realization hit him like a physical blow. 15 years. 15 years of telling himself he had no choice, that survival justified anything, that the world had given him impossible options and he'd simply chosen the one that kept him alive. 15 years of building walls inside himself so he wouldn't have to feel what he was doing. But the walls were crumbling now, and behind them was something he'd been avoiding since that first hunt in the brutal winter of 1832. The truth about what he'd become. He'd been freed from slavery at 6 years old. And he'd spent the next 31 years using that freedom to ensure others never found theirs. He'd become the instrument of the very system that had degraded his mother, that had stolen her life, that had made his own existence a curse his father tried to erase. He'd become the thing he should have fought against. Because, Silas said finally, his voice hollow, I have been damned for 15 years, and I will not be damned for one more day. The words hung in the humid air like a confession. Tobias's grip on the stick loosened slightly. You expect me to believe you? You're Silas Garrison. You're a monster, Silas finished. Yes, I know what I am. He reached into his coat slowly, carefully, so the young man in the water wouldn't panic. Pulled out a small leather pouch and tossed it. It landed in the mud at the water's edge with a soft clink. Money, Silas said. Enough for supplies if you need them. Travel only at night. The Brooks family, they're friends. They'll know you're coming. Trust no one who isn't a Quaker. Tobias stared at the pouch like it might be a snake. This is a trick. It's not. You'll follow me. Track me. Bring me back. No. Silas turned back to his horse. The dogs whined, still confused, still waiting for commands that weren't coming. I won't. His hands moved to his saddlebag. Pulled out something wrapped in oilcloth. The journal. 15 years of documentation. 15 years of names and faces and the slow destruction of his own soul, all bound in worn leather. He unwrapped it. Held it for a moment, feeling its weight. Not the physical weight, which was slight, but the weight of what it contained. Every hunt, every capture, every justification he'd scrawled in desperate attempts to convince himself he was still human. And in the final pages, something else. Something he'd been gathering for years without fully understanding why. Information. Intelligence. Safe houses and patrol routes and plantation layouts. The patterns of slave catchers. The schedules of overseers. Everything a person would need to escape, documented in careful detail by someone who knew the system from inside. He'd been preparing for this moment, he realized. Perhaps for years. Writing down everything that could help others succeed where those he'd captured had failed. Waiting for the day when he'd finally find the courage to let it be used. That day was today. Silas walked to the water's edge and held out the journal. "Take this." Tobias didn't move. "What is it?" "Everything," Silas said simply. "Everything I know. Everything that can help your people escape. Names, locations, patterns. It's all in there." He paused. "Along with my sins. What I did. Who I brought back. Let someone know. Let them know what I did, and why I finally stopped. I don't understand. You don't have to." Silas took another step forward, water soaking into his boots. "Just take it. Read it. Get it to people who can use it. And live, Tobias. However long you have, wherever you go, live." For a long moment, neither man moved. The stream flowed between them, dark and indifferent. The dogs had quieted, sensing that whatever was happening was beyond their understanding. The bayou hummed with its endless song of insects and birds and things that lived in shadow. Finally, Tobias moved forward. Took the journal with shaking hands. Their fingers brushed for an instant. Slave hunter and runaway, two men born into impossible circumstances, connected by this single moment of choice. "Why now?" Tobias whispered. "After 15 years, why now?" Silas met his eyes. In them, Tobias saw something that looked like relief. Or maybe just exhaustion so profound it had become a kind of peace. "Because I saw my mother in your face," Silas said quietly. "And I couldn't do it again." He turned and walked back to his horse. Mounted. Took up the dog's leads. And without looking back, he said one last thing. "Go. Before I lose my courage." Tobias climbed from the water, the journal clutched to his chest like a lifeline. And he ran. Tobias ran until his legs gave out, then crawled, then dragged himself forward through the mud until he found a hollow beneath the roots of a massive cypress where he could finally stop and breathe. The journal pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat. He unwrapped the oilcloth with trembling fingers, hardly daring to believe what had just happened. One moment he'd been standing in that stream waiting to die, the next a man who'd built his entire life on hunting people like him had simply let him go. More than that, had given him this. The leather cover was worn smooth by years of handling. No title, no marking on the outside. Just brown leather cracked at the corners, soft as skin. Tobias opened it. The first page made his breath catch. Male, age 27. Name, Samuel. Captured near Point Capee Parish, April 1833. Wife, Hattie, field worker. 3 children. Subject attempted to negotiate, offered to return willingly if family could be freed. Offer rejected by owner. Subject returned in chains. Witnessed punishment, 50 lashes. Subject survived. The handwriting was careful, precise. Each letter formed with deliberate care, as if the act of writing was itself a kind of penance. Tobias turned the page. Another entry. Then another. Names and dates and terrible details, page after page of human suffering documented in black ink that had faded to brown with age. Some entries were brief, just facts. Others included fragments of conversation, last words, desperate pleas that Silas Garrison had apparently written down even as he ignored them. Female, age 19. Name, Ruth. Captured near Thibodaux, June 1834. Pregnant, approximately 6 months. Begged for her unborn child. Returned to Boudreaux Plantation. Child born in bondage 2 months later. Tobias's hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the journal. This wasn't just a record of hunts. This was a testimony. A confession written by a man who'd known exactly what he was doing, who'd documented his own damnation in careful detail. But why? Why keep such records unless some part of him knew it was wrong? Unless some part of him was screaming beneath the surface, demanding to be heard? He turned more pages, moving forward through the years. The entries grew longer, more detailed. The justifications Silas had written to himself appeared in the margins. No choice. Must survive. Winter coming. But as the years progressed, those justifications were crossed out, rewritten, questioned, until they disappeared entirely. By the 10th year, there were no more excuses. Just names and the weight of what had been done to them. Tobias reached the final pages and found something that made his heart race. Maps. Rough sketches of plantations with patrol routes marked in red ink. Names of Quaker families and their locations. Safe houses along routes north. The schedules of overseers, their habits, their weaknesses. Information about which roads were watched and which waterways offered passage. Intelligence. Gathered over 15 years by someone who knew the slave-catching system from the inside. Written in careful detail, as if Silas had been preparing for this moment all along, building an escape route even as he dragged people back to bondage. At the very bottom of the last page with writing, a single sentence stood alone. If you are reading this, I finally found the courage to stop. Tobias sat in that hollow beneath the cypress roots, holding a document that could save lives or cost them, depending on who found it. If this fell into the wrong hands, into the hands of plantation owners or slave catchers or the parish authorities, the information would be used to tighten the noose, to make escape even harder. But if it reached the right people? He thought of the 17 people Silas had mentioned who might escape using this information. Thought of the families who might stay together, the children who might grow up free, the dreams that might survive long enough to become real. This wasn't just about his own escape anymore. The journal in his hands was bigger than that. It was evidence of a system that destroyed everyone it touched, even those who thought they'd escaped it, even those who'd been freed but never found freedom. Tobias wrapped the journal carefully back in its oilcloth, tucked it inside his shirt where it would stay dry and close. Then he pulled himself upright, using the cypress roots for support. His body still screamed with exhaustion. His feet were torn and bleeding. His stomach cramped with hunger. But he had direction now. 17 miles northeast to the Brooks family. And after that, if he survived, a longer journey north carrying 15 years of secrets that could change everything. He thought of Silas Garrison riding back to Franklin with empty hands and a story about drowning that no one would quite believe. Thought of what that choice would cost the tracker, his reputation, his livelihood, maybe his life. The man had destroyed himself to save one person he'd never met. Tobias didn't understand it. Couldn't reconcile the monster from the stories with a man who'd stood at that stream's edge and chosen redemption over everything he'd built his life on. But he understood this. He was carrying more than a journal now. He was carrying proof that even the worst among us could choose differently. That even after 15 years of serving evil, a man could still turn around and walk the other way. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Tobias checked his position by the light, oriented himself northeast, and began moving through the swamp with renewed purpose. Behind him, his trail would go cold. Silas Garrison would see to that. Ahead, 17 miles of wilderness and then safety. Maybe. And pressed against his chest, a journal that contained both damnation and salvation, depending on whose hands it reached. Tobias moved into deeper shadow, and the bayou swallowed him whole. But this time, he wasn't running from something. He was running toward it. That night, hidden in a grove of willow trees 6 miles from where Silas had released him, Tobias read the journal by moonlight. He couldn't stop himself. Despite the exhaustion, despite knowing he should be moving, something compelled him to understand what he was carrying, to know the full weight of what had been placed in his hands. The early entries were clinical, almost detached. Male, age 32. Name, Amos. Captured Assumption Parish, February 1833. Returned to Thornton Plantation. Payment received, $15. Short. Factual. As if Silas had been documenting livestock rather than human lives. But even in those early pages, there were cracks. Small notations in the margins that revealed a mind at war with itself. He had children. 3 of them. She asked me if I had a mother. I did not answer. He reminded me of, this one was crossed out so heavily the paper had torn. As Tobias moved through the years, the entries grew longer, more detailed. Silas had started recording not just the captures, but the stories behind them. Why people ran. Who they left behind. What they said in those final moments before being returned to bondage. Female, age 24. Name, Abney. Tobias stopped. Read the name again. Abney. The same name as Silas's mother. No relation. But the name. God help me, the name. She sang while I brought her back. A song I remembered from childhood. I had to stop twice because I could not see the trail through. The rest was illegible, the ink smeared as if water had fallen on the page. Page after page revealed a man slowly destroying himself from the inside. Silas had documented his own descent with the same precision he'd used to document his hunts. The justifications appeared and reappeared like a desperate mantra. I must eat. Winter is coming. I have no other skills. The world offers me no other options. This is survival. Only survival. But beneath these words, written in smaller script, as if Silas was afraid to make them too visible even to himself. But they must survive too. And I am the reason they don't. In the 7th year, the justifications started being crossed out. Sometimes gently, a single line through the words. Other times violently, the pen pressed so hard it tore the paper. By the 10th year, there were no more justifications at all. Just names and stories and a growing catalogue of guilt that seemed to bleed from every page. Male, age 19. Name, Elijah. He was the same age I was when I took my first tracking job. He looked at me and said, "You're one of us." I told him I wasn't. But I am. I was born in the same chains I drag people back to. What does that make me? Tobias's throat tightened as he read. This wasn't the record of a monster. This was the record of a man trapped in a cage of his own making, documenting his own damnation because he lacked the courage to stop. Until today. Then Tobias reached the final section of the journal, and everything changed. The last 30 pages weren't about captures at all. They were about escape. Silas had drawn maps, crude but detailed, of every plantation in a 50-mile radius. He'd marked the locations of slave quarters, overseer cabins, main houses. He'd noted which overseers drank heavily and when, which dogs were aggressive and which could be calmed, which roads were patrolled and which were overlooked. Beaumont Plantation, patrols change at midnight. 15-minute gap when both shifts return to main house. East fence near the cane fields has rotted posts, can be pushed through with minimal force. Dakota Plantation, owner keeps bloodhounds in kennels near stable. Dogs can be distracted with raw meat thrown over north wall. Best escape route, through rice fields to Bayou, then northeast. There were lists of Quaker families, the Brooks, the Coffins, the Lewises, with detailed directions to their homes and notes about their willingness to help. Routes through the swamps that avoided patrol areas. Instructions on which moss could be eaten in desperation, which berries were poison, where fresh water could be found. It was an escape manual. A guide for freedom written by the man who'd spent 15 years preventing it. And more than that, it was intelligence that could only have come from inside the system. Details about patrol patterns that changed seasonally. The names of slave catchers and their methods. The locations of safe houses that even most abolitionists didn't know about. Silas hadn't just been documenting his hunts. He'd been gathering information, building a weapon, preparing for the day when he'd finally choose to use his knowledge to help rather than harm. Tobias sat back against the willow trunk, the journal heavy in his lap. This changed everything. Now, before I tell you what happened to that journal, whether Tobias survived, and how Silas's choice rippled outward in ways neither man could have imagined, I need you to understand something. Stories like this were buried, erased. The people who wanted them forgotten nearly succeeded. For every name in Silas's journal, there were thousands more whose stories disappeared entirely, whose choices and courage and humanity were deliberately written out of history. This is why these accounts matter. Why we dig through archives and family records and forgotten documents to find the truth about what happened and who people really were. Not the simplified versions. Not the comfortable narratives. The complicated, painful, necessary truth. If you believe these voices deserve to be heard, if you think this history matters and should never be forgotten, then subscribe to this channel. Join those of us who refuse to let these stories be silenced. Share this with someone who needs to know that history is never as simple as we were taught. Because what happened next would never have been possible if Tobias had let that journal disappear into the swamp. If he decided it was too dangerous, too complicated, too damning to everyone involved. But he didn't. Tobias wrapped the journal back in its oilcloth with hands that no longer shook from exhaustion, but from understanding the magnitude of what he carried. This wasn't just evidence of one man's crimes. It was a blueprint for freedom. A weapon forged over 15 years by someone who'd known the system intimately enough to document its weaknesses. In the right hands, this journal could save lives. Dozens of lives. Maybe more. In the wrong hands, it would destroy everyone whose name appeared in those final pages. The Quaker families, the safe house operators, the people who'd risked everything to help strangers find freedom. Tobias had 17 miles to decide who those right hands belonged to. He stood, tucked the journal securely inside his shirt, and continued northeast through the darkness. The weight against his chest felt like responsibility, like possibility, like the hope his mother had tried to teach him to abandon, and the hope his father had died for. Behind him, somewhere in that vast bayou, Silas Garrison was riding back to face whatever consequences his choice would bring. Ahead, the Brooks family waited, unaware that their names were written in ink that could condemn or liberate, depending on how the next few days unfolded. And pressed between them, carried through swamp and shadow by a young man who dared to run. 15 years of secrets that would eventually change the course of dozens of lives, if Tobias survived long enough to deliver them. Tobias collapsed on the porch of the Brooks family home 6 days after Silas Garrison let him go, more corpse than man, the journal still pressed against his ribs like a talisman that had kept him alive through sheer force of will. Ezra Brooks, a Quaker farmer in his 50s with kind eyes and calloused hands, found him at dawn when he stepped out to milk the cows. The young man was unconscious, feet torn to ribbons, lips cracked and bleeding, but his arms were locked around something wrapped in oilcloth with a grip so tight they had to pry his fingers loose one at a time. "Martha," Ezra called to his wife. "Bring water. And bandages. We have a guest." They nursed him for 3 days before Tobias could speak coherently. On the 4th day, when he finally unwrapped the journal and explained what it was, where it had come from, who had given it to him, what it contained, Ezra Brooks sat in stunned silence for a full minute before reaching for it with trembling hands. "Does thee understand what this is?" Ezra whispered, turning pages with reverence usually reserved for scripture. This is knowledge we've needed for years. Routes, schedules, safe approaches." He looked up at Tobias with something like awe. "This could save lives." "That's what he said." Tobias's voice was still raw from days without water. "The man who hunted us. He said to let people know. People who could use it." Within a week, the journal had been carefully transported to a meeting of Underground Railroad conductors in a barn outside Baton Rouge. 12 people gathered by lantern light: Quakers, free black conductors, a Methodist minister, 2 women who ran safe houses, and passed the leather-bound volume between them with the solemnity of people holding something sacred and dangerous in equal measure. They couldn't keep it intact. Too risky. If authorities found it, everyone whose name appeared in those pages would hang. So they copied it. Carefully, methodically, over the course of 3 nights. Different people transcribed different sections. Maps were reproduced without the accompanying names. Intelligence about patrol patterns was written in code. Safe house locations were memorized rather than written down, then the original pages describing them were burned. The information was distributed like seeds scattered on fertile ground. A map here, a schedule there, a list of which overseers could be bribed and which were incorruptible. Each conductor received only the pieces relevant to their section of the route, protecting the whole network if any single part was compromised. And then they put it to use. The first escape came 3 weeks after Tobias reached the Brooks family. A woman named Dinah, 28 years old, fled the Rousseau plantation with her 2 children using a route that avoided patrol zones Silas had documented. She followed directions copied from his journal, through the rice fields at the northwest corner, across the shallow ford where the dogs lost scent in running water, to a safe house run by a widow Silas had identified as sympathetic. She made it to Tennessee, then Ohio, then Canada. 2 months later, 3 men escaped from the Thibodaux area using intelligence about overseer shift changes that Silas had meticulously recorded. They traveled only during the 15-minute gaps he'd noted, moved through terrain he'd marked as unwatched, reached contacts he'd identified. All 3 made it north. By the end of 1848, 17 people had successfully escaped from St. Mary Parish and the surrounding area. More successful escapes in 1 year than the previous 5 years combined. Each one used some piece of information Silas Garrison had gathered during his 15 years of hunting. Each one traveled routes he'd mapped, avoided patrols he'd documented, found help at houses he'd identified. The plantation owners noticed. How could they not? Charles Beaumont hosted a meeting of concerned planters in early 1849, standing on his porch with a glass of whiskey and a face red with frustration. "Something's changed," he insisted. "These runners are too well informed. They know patrol schedules. They know which roads we watch. It's as if someone's giving them intelligence. Perhaps your own people are involved, another planter suggested. All of them. Across multiple plantations. Beaumont shook his head. No. This is organized. Professional. Someone who knows our methods is teaching them how to evade us. They never suspected that the source of that knowledge had been the best tracker in Louisiana. Never imagined that Silas Garrison's final act had been to dismantle the very system he'd served. The irony would have been almost beautiful if it hadn't been built on so much suffering. The network grew stronger with each successful escape. Conductors refined their methods using Silas's intelligence. New safe houses opened along routes he'd identified as viable. The Underground Railroad in southern Louisiana, which had been struggling and fragmented, became coordinated and effective. By 1850, the number had grown beyond 17. Exact records weren't kept, too dangerous, but estimates suggested that intelligence originating from Silas's journal had contributed to at least 40 successful escapes, possibly more. 40 lives. 40 people who found freedom because one man had finally chosen to use his knowledge for liberation rather than capture. It didn't erase what he'd done. Couldn't balance the scales against 147 people he'd dragged back to bondage. The mathematics of redemption don't work that way. You can't subtract suffering from suffering and arrive at forgiveness. But it mattered. To those 40 people and their families, to their children who would be born free instead of enslaved, to the generations that would follow, it mattered immensely. Tobias eventually made it to Chicago, carrying with him not just his own freedom but the knowledge of what Silas Garrison had given up to make that freedom possible. He kept the original journal hidden, protected, passing it down through his family with instructions that were both simple and profound. This is proof that even the worst among us can choose differently. Don't let anyone forget that. And in Louisiana, plantation owners continued to puzzle over the sudden effectiveness of the escape network, never knowing that the answer lay in 15 leather-bound journals that had once sat on a shelf in a modest house in Franklin. One man's redemption, purchased at the cost of everything he'd built his life on, rippling outward in ways he would never see. Changing fates. Saving lives. Proving that choice, however late it comes, always matters. Silas returned to the Beaumont plantation 3 days after releasing Tobias, his face arranged into an expression he'd perfected over 15 years, neutral, professional, slightly regretful. Charles Beaumont met him on the wide porch of the main house, whiskey in hand despite the early hour. Well, the swamp took him, Silas said, meeting the planter's eyes without flinching. Found his trail ending at a deep channel near Bayou Teche. Currents strong there. No body recovered, but no man survives those waters if he goes under. It was a good lie. Plausible. The kind of thing that happened often enough in Louisiana's treacherous wetlands that no one would question it too deeply. Beaumont's jaw tightened. You're telling me the best tracker in Louisiana lost a runner to drowning? I'm telling you the bayou is older and meaner than any man who tries to cross it. Silas kept his voice flat. Your property is gone. I did what I could. The planter stared at him for a long moment, then spat over the porch railing. First failure in 15 years. You're slipping, Garrison. Perhaps. Beaumont paid him anyway, half the promised reward for the attempt, handed over with a dismissive gesture that made clear Silas's reputation had taken a blow. Word would spread. The infallible tracker had failed. Other planters would remember that when they needed someone found. Silas took the money without comment and rode back to Franklin as the sun climbed toward noon. That night, alone in his modest house, he stood before the shelf where his journals had lived for 15 years. 14 volumes remained, their spines aligned with precise care. But the gap where the 15th had rested seemed to swallow all the light in the room. He'd documented 147 lives in those pages. 147 people dragged back to bondage. And now that record was gone, carried north by a young man who might not survive another week. Silas sat at his table and tried to begin a new journal. Put pen to paper. Wrote the date, August 15th, 1847, and then stopped. There was nothing more to write. No hunt to document. No justifications to scratch out in desperate attempt at absolution. Just silence and the empty shelf and the ghost of every name he'd ever recorded. He never started another volume. Over the following months, plantation owners still came calling. Jobs were offered. But Silas found reasons to decline. Too busy with other work, illness, vague excuses that grew thinner with each telling. The truth was simpler and more complicated than any lie. His hands were no longer steady. When he held rope or shackles, they shook. When he looked at his bloodhounds, he saw accusation in their amber eyes. The few hunts he did accept that year ended badly. He lost trails he would have followed easily before. Made mistakes that allowed runners to escape. His reputation, already damaged by the Beaumont failure, crumbled further with each botched job. By spring of 1848, the requests had stopped coming entirely. Silas sold his bloodhounds to a trader from Natchez. Watched them loaded into a wagon and driven away, their confused whining fading into distance. The gray mare he kept, but only for transportation. She grew fat from lack of work, grazing in the small paddock behind his house while Silas sat inside and stared at walls. He paid his debts when he could, fell behind when he couldn't. The house needed repairs he didn't make. The garden grew wild with weeds he didn't pull. People in Franklin who'd once nodded respectfully when he passed now looked through him as if he'd already vanished. Autumn came to Louisiana in 1849 with unusual chill. Leaves turned early. The air carried hints of winter that wouldn't arrive for months yet. In October, a neighbor noticed Silas hadn't been seen in several days. The door to his house stood open. Inside, the furniture remained, but personal items were gone. The gray mare was missing from the paddock. On the table sat a stack of coins, not enough to cover his debts, but enough to show he'd tried. The 14 journals were gone from their shelf. Some said he'd fled north, to Canada or beyond, seeking redemption in territory where slavery couldn't follow. Others claimed they'd seen him heading west, toward Texas, trying to outrun his past by putting distance between himself and the bayous where he'd made his name. A few whispered darker theories, that he'd walked into the swamps he knew so well and simply never walked out, choosing to let the wilderness claim him the way it had claimed so many of the people he'd hunted. The truth was that nobody knew. Silas Garrison, who'd been impossible to escape from for 15 years, had himself escaped completely. His house was eventually sold for unpaid debts. A family from Baton Rouge bought it, painted the walls, planted new gardens. They knew nothing of its previous owner except that he'd been some kind of tracker and had left suddenly. Within 5 years, most people in Franklin had forgotten his name entirely. The younger generation never heard it at all. Silas Garrison faded into the kind of obscurity that feels like mercy, remembered only by those who'd feared him, and they were not inclined to speak his name aloud. But somewhere, north, south, west, or beneath the dark waters of some nameless bayou, the man who'd spent 15 years hunting others had finally found a way to disappear himself. Whether he found peace in that disappearance, or simply a different kind of torment, no one would ever know. Some endings remain uncertain. Some questions go unanswered. And perhaps, for a man whose entire life had been defined by the hunt, by the inevitable capture, by never allowing anyone to escape. Perhaps the only fitting end was one where he himself could not be found. The swamps kept their secrets, and Silas Garrison became one of them. 119 years after Silas Garrison vanished from Franklin, Louisiana, a woman named Dorothy Freeman stood in the kitchen of an old house on the south side of Chicago, holding a sledgehammer and wondering what her great-great-grandfather had been thinking when he built this wall. The house had belonged to Tobias. He'd purchased it in 1872, 25 years after his escape from the Beaumont plantation, after the war had ended and Reconstruction had opened possibilities that seemed impossible in 1847. He'd lived there until his death in 1891, and the house had passed through his family ever since. Daughters and granddaughters and great-granddaughters, each generation adding their own touches while preserving the bones of what Tobias had built. Dorothy was renovating the kitchen, finally tearing out the old plaster to install modern cabinets. When the wall came down in a cloud of dust and fragments, something fell from inside the cavity. A package, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived more than a century, sealed in darkness. She picked it up carefully, her contractor watching with curiosity as she unwrapped layers of protective fabric. Inside was a leather-bound journal, the cover cracked with age, the pages yellowed to the color of old bone. Dorothy opened it with trembling hands. The first page stopped her breath. Male, age 27. Name, Samuel. Captured near Point Capee Parish, April 1833. She read 3 more entries before calling the University of Chicago. By evening, 2 historians were sitting at her kitchen table, wearing white gloves, turning pages with reverence usually reserved for religious texts. What they found shook the academic world. The journal was unprecedented, a complete inside record of Louisiana's slave-catching apparatus, written by one of its most successful practitioners. But more than that, it was a psychological document, a portrait of a man slowly destroying himself through the work he did to survive. The entries revealed patterns historians had only theorized about. The coordination between plantations and catchers. The use of bloodhounds and their training. The routes escapees took and the tactics used to track them. Information that filled gaps in the historical record and confirmed suspicions scholars had held for decades. But what truly stunned them came in the margins, in the crossed-out justifications and the increasingly desperate self-examination that filled the later volumes. Yes, there were more, Dorothy discovered, hidden throughout the house in places Tobias had secreted them. 14 journals total, documenting 15 years of hunting. And in those pages, buried among the clinical documentation, was the truth about Silas Garrison himself. He'd been born in Virginia. Born enslaved. His mother's name was Abney, stolen from the Gold Coast. His father was Thaddeus Garrison, who'd freed his mixed-race son at 6 years old not from love but from shame. The most feared slave hunter in Louisiana had himself been born in chains. The revelation made national news. Newspapers ran stories about the complicated legacy of a man who'd used his freedom to hunt those seeking theirs. Academic papers were written analyzing the psychological toll documented in his journals. Debates raged about whether Silas deserved condemnation or sympathy, whether his final act of redemption mattered against 15 years of service to slavery. Researchers tracked down the Garrison family of Virginia. The descendants were shocked. They'd had no idea. Their family history made no mention of Silas. He'd been erased, forgotten, his existence inconvenient to the narrative they'd constructed about themselves. But he'd existed. The journals proved it. 147 names proved it. The intelligence he'd gathered and finally shared proved it. Dorothy Freeman, standing in her kitchen with her great-great-grandfather's legacy spread across the table, found the final entry in the last journal. Dated October 3, 1849, written in handwriting that had grown shaky compared to the confident script of earlier years. 7 words: I have paid. But the debt remains. She understood then why Tobias had hidden these journals instead of destroying them. Why he'd protected them for 44 years until his death, then passed the responsibility to his daughter with instructions to keep them safe. Because the story was too complicated to erase, too important to forget, too necessary to the understanding of what slavery had done, not just to those it enslaved, but to everyone it touched, even those who thought they'd escaped it. The cypress trees still stand in Bayou Teche. Spanish moss still hangs from their branches like prayers left unanswered. The water still runs dark, keeping secrets it will never tell. Silas Garrison's story rests there among all the others, stories too painful to speak aloud, too important to let die. His journals stand as testimony to something we'd rather not acknowledge, that people can be broken by systems designed to break them. That impossible circumstances create impossible choices. That survival can corrupt even those who understand its cost. But they also testify to something else. That redemption, when it finally comes, is never clean or simple. That it doesn't erase what came before or balance the scales of justice. That freedom has always been purchased at costs too high to calculate. And that even those who serve evil, who build their lives on the suffering of others, who become the instruments of oppression, even they can, in their final moments, choose otherwise. The question that haunts anyone who reads those journals is this: what would you have done? If you'd been born into a world that gave you only terrible choices, freedom purchased through others' bondage, survival bought with their suffering, could you have chosen differently? Would you have found the courage to stop after 1 year? 5 years? 10? Or would you, like Silas, have needed 15 years and one young man's defiant stand to finally break? We'd all like to think we'd choose better. We'd all like to believe we'd never become what Silas became. But the journals suggest otherwise. They suggest that ordinary people, given impossible options, will do terrible things to survive. And that recognizing this about ourselves, about our own capacity for moral compromise when survival demands it, is necessary if we're going to understand our history honestly. This diary survived because someone believed it mattered. Because Tobias carried it north when he could barely carry himself. Because his descendants protected it for over a century, knowing the truth it contained was too important to lose, too complicated to simplify, too necessary to forget. These stories survive only when we refuse to let them die. Subscribe to this channel. Share these histories with people who need to understand that the past was never simple, never clean, never easily divided into heroes and villains. Make sure the voices they tried to silence, all of them, even the difficult ones, even the ones that make us uncomfortable, are finally heard. The debt, as Silas wrote, still remains. And it's on us to remember.